The council chamber fell silent when Dr. Yuki Tanaka stepped forward to speak. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes, but her voice carried the weight of 20 years of research and sacrifice. Behind her floated a hologram of something that should not exist. Distinguished members of the United Earth Council. She began, "I present to you the dark matter reactor." Whispers erupted across the chamber like wildfire spreading through dry grass. For 10,000 years, the elder races of the galaxy had declared one truth: absolute and unbreakable. Dark matter could be observed but never touched and never harnessed. The Vethkai Dominion had built their empire on this law, and they enforced it with iron fists across 1,000 star systems. The crystalline hegemony had carved out their domain, believing themselves masters of physics and reality itself, and humanity had been nothing more than a footnote in galactic history. 12 colony worlds and a homeworld called Earth were all that humans possessed. They were tolerated like children playing in the Garden of Giants who could crush them whenever they wished. But Dr. Tanaka had found something the giants missed. The elder races tried to contain dark matter. She explained as the hologram shifted and changed. They built cages of energy and fields of force, but dark matter slipped through every barrier they created. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had walked through hell and emerged carrying fire. We took a different approach because we had no choice but to think differently. The hologram showed a reactor core that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Our reactor does not contain dark matter because containment is impossible. As the elders discovered long ago, she paused and let the tension build in the chamber. Instead, our reactor becomes dark matter, and it phases between states of existence like a door swinging between two rooms. Admiral Marcus Chun sat in the front row, and he felt his heart pound against his ribs. He had seen the test flights, and he had watched ships vanish from one point in space and appear at another 40 light years away in the span of a single heartbeat. The implications were staggering, beyond measure. With this technology, Dr. Tanaka continued, human ships can slip through the spaces between spaces, and we can travel distances that would take conventional vessels centuries to cross. She turned to face the council directly, and her eyes burned with fierce determination. We are no longer prisoners of the slow crawl between stars. The chamber erupted in chaos as council members shouted questions and demands, but Admiral Chan remained still because he knew what was coming next. He had received a transmission from Vethkai space just 3 hours ago. Elder races had spies everywhere, and they had learned of humanity's breakthrough. High Archon Salith of the Vethkai Dominion had broadcast his ultimatum across every frequency that human receivers could detect: surrender the technology within 30 cycles. The alien had declared with cold contempt dripping from every word, or face the complete and total extinction of your species. Chun had watched the recording 7 times, and each time he noticed something new in the Archon's eyes, not anger and not even hatred, just absolute certainty. The humans would comply because they had no other option available to them. The Vethkai had crushed rebellions before, and they had erased species from existence, and they had done it so many times that genocide had become routine for them. They expected humanity to beg and grovel and hand over their only advantage. They expected wrong. After the council session ended, Admiral Chun found Dr. Tanaka standing alone on the observation deck. Earth floated below them, like a blue and green jewel wrapped in white clouds. "How many ships can you build in 30 days?" he asked, without preamble. She turned to look at him, and her expression was unreadable. "If we strip every shipyard and work every engineer around the clock without rest," she said slowly, "we can complete 12 vessels of the new class. 12 ships against the entire Vethkai armada. 12 ships that can go where no Vethkai vessel can follow and strike from angles they cannot predict or defend against." Chun nodded and pulled up a holographic display showing ship schematics. "I have been working with our best naval architects, and we have designed something new. The ship that appeared in the display was sleek and angular, and it seemed to flow like liquid metal frozen in motion. We call them the Voidbreaker class, Chum said. They are built around the dark matter reactor with every system optimized for phase combat and rapid void transitions. Dr. Tanaka studied the design with a critical eye. The power requirements are enormous and the structural stress during phase transitions will be severe. Can it be done? She was quiet for a long moment as she calculated variables and stress tolerances in her mind. Yes, she finally said. It can be done, but the crews will need to be volunteers who understand the risks they face. They will be. Chun turned back to the viewport and watched. Earth rotates slowly beneath them. Somewhere out there the Vethkai were gathering their fleets and sharpening their weapons. They had given humanity 30 days to surrender. They had no idea what humans could accomplish when their backs were against the wall. The Archon expects us to come crawling on our knees, Chun said quietly. He expects us to beg for mercy and accept whatever scraps he offers. Dia Tanaka stood beside him, and her reflection ghosted in the transparent aluminum. What do you expect, Admiral? He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I expect that 30 days from now, the galaxy will learn why they should never have underestimated humanity. In shipyards across human space workers began their shifts. Metal was shaped and reactors were assembled and weapons were installed. Warships took form from raw materials and desperate hope, and in the void between stars the Vethkai Armada gathered like storm clouds preparing to unleash destruction. They had conquered 100 species, and they had ruled for 10,000 years. They believed themselves invincible and eternal and beyond all challenge, but they had never faced an enemy with nothing left to lose. They had never faced humanity. The countdown began, and every human who could work, every scientist who could calculate did. Calculate every soldier who could train did train. 20 days later, the 12 Voidbreakers sat ready in their berths. Their halls gleamed with newness, and their reactors hummed with power that the galaxy had never seen before. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the flagship, and he looked at the stars that had always seemed so far away. They gave us 30 days, he said to his crew with quiet confidence. We only needed 20. The Vethkai Armada arrived at Kepler 442 with 3,000 warships that blotted out the stars. High Arkham Saleth stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the blue world grow larger in the viewport. 2 million humans lived on that planet, and they tended vast farms that fed a dozen colony worlds. They had no warships and no orbital defenses and no way to fight back against the storm that was coming. Zilith smiled with cruel satisfaction. Begin the cleansing. He ordered. Plasma bombardment rained down on the northern continent like the wrath of angry god cities. Vanished, and pillars of fire that climbed toward the heavens. Forests became ash and oceans boiled, and the screams of the dying were swallowed by the roar of destruction. Silith made sure to broadcast everything across every frequency in the galaxy. Let the younger races watch, and let them learn what happened to species that dared to challenge the natural order. Let humanity see what awaited them on every world they called home. This is the price of defiance, he announced to the cosmos. This is the fate that awaits all who forget their place beneath us. The bombardment continued for 3 hours, and the planet's surface glowed with wounds of molten rock. Saleth was preparing to order the second phase of destruction when his sensor officer made a sound of confusion. Archon, we are detecting void disturbances at the edge of the system. Explain. Space itself appears to be tearing open in 12 locations. Saleth turned to the main display and watched as reality cracked like ice breaking on a frozen lake. 12 ships emerged from the wounds, and the fabric of space-time healed behind them as if they had never been there. They were small vessels, barely larger than Vethkai escort frigates. The Entire human fleet would not outmass a single one of his dreadnoughts. Is this their response? Salith laughed, and his bridge crew joined him in mocking amusement. 12 ships against 3,000. He opened a channel to the human vessels. I am High Archon Selith of the Vethkai, Dominion, and you are witnessing the consequences of your species' arrogance. A human voice responded, calm and steady. This is Admiral Marcus, Chun of the United Earth Navy, and we are here to discuss those consequences. There is nothing to discuss, insect, and your tiny fleet cannot save this world or your species. Perhaps not, Chun replied, but we can certainly make you regret this day. Salith cut the channel and waved dismissively. Destroy them. 100. Vethkai warships broke formation and accelerated toward the human vessels, their weapons charged and targeting. Systems locked on and crews prepared for the easiest victory of their careers. The lead ship fired a spread of plasma torpedoes that streaked toward the nearest human vessel and passed through empty space. The human ship was simply gone, vanished from existence between one moment and the next. Sensor officers across the Vethkai fleet shouted in confusion. The human ships were appearing and disappearing like ghosts flickering in and out of reality itself. Weapons fire passed through spaces where targets had been microseconds before, and then the humans fired back. Energy beams lanced out from impossible angles, striking Vethkai. Ships from directions that should have been blocked by shields missiles appeared inside defensive perimeters as if they had materialized from nothing. The first Vethkai warship exploded, and then the second, and then the third. Zelith watched in growing disbelief as his ships died. What is happening? He demanded. They are phasing through our attacks, Archon, and they are appearing inside our shield envelopes to fire before phasing out again. That is impossible. But the explosions blooming across his fleet said otherwise. The human ships danced through the battle like spirits immune to physical harm. They struck and vanished, and struck again. Vethkai captains screamed for support as their vessels were torn apart by weapons that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then one human ship did something different. The UES Defiant accelerated toward the Vethkai flagship on a collision course. They mean to ram us. Salith snarled. All batteries focus on that vessel. Thousands of weapons turned toward the charging ship. The Defiant phased through every shot as if they were nothing but light and shadow. It grew larger in the viewport, and Salith felt something he had not experienced in centuries: fear. The Defiant struck the flagship at impossible velocity. The moment of impact, its dark matter reactor destabilized deliberately and catastrophically. Utley screamed. A wound tore open in the fabric of space-time. And it was hungry. The flagship was pulled into the void along with 10 dreadnoughts that had been too close to escape. Salith had one moment to understand that everything he believed about the universe was wrong. Then he and 800,000 Vethkai soldiers ceased to exist. Remaining human ships continued their assault for another hour. They phased through counterattacks and struck with precision and withdrew before the enemy could adapt. When it was over, the Vethkai armada had lost 400 ships. The survivors fled in disarray, unable to comprehend what had happened to them. On the surface of Kepler 442, the survivors of the bombardment emerged from underground shelters. They looked up at the sky and saw the retreating lights of their enemies, and they wept with relief and grief, and something that felt like hope. Admiral Chun surveyed the battlefield from his command deck. 37 human sailors had died on the Defiant, giving their lives to take the enemy flagship. They had known the cost before they volunteered, and they had gone anyway. Admiral, his communications officer reported, the galaxy is watching, and every species with a receiver is picking up recordings of this battle. Chun nodded slowly. Let them watch, and let them see what happens when you corner humanity. He opened the broadcast channel and spoke words that would echo across the stars. The Vethkai believed they could burn our worlds and erase our people and face no consequences. His voice was steady, but underneath it burned a fire that would not be extinguished. They believed wrong, and today they learned that humanity does not surrender, and we do not beg, and we do not go quietly into the darkness. He paused and let the weight of the moment settle. We were forged in the fire of a hostile universe, and we have faced extinction before, and we are still here. Across the galaxy, younger races heard his words and felt something stir in their hearts. The Tith, who had been subjugated for millennia, whispered to each other in secret. The Morrow, who had accepted their place at the bottom of the hierarchy, looked up with new eyes. The Crystalline, who had been conquered so long ago that they had forgotten freedom, listened and remembered. Old order had stood for 10,000 years. Today it began to crack, and in the void between stars, humanity prepared for what came next, because they knew this was only the beginning. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler 442, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable. Humanity had built 90 Voidbreaker warships, and each one represented a threat that the elder races could not ignore. For the first time in 10,000 years, the ancient empires set aside their rivalries and united against a common enemy. The coalition of primacy brought together 17 species under one banner with one goal: complete and total extinction of humanity. Ambassador Priya Sharma stood before the Galactic Concord and faced representatives from every major power in known space. The chamber was vast and ancient, and designed to make younger species feel small and insignificant. She refused to feel either. You call yourselves the Coalition of Primacy, she said, and her voice echoed through the great hall. You have united against humanity because you fear what we represent. The Vethkai representative hissed with contempt. We fear nothing, and we certainly do not fear insects who stumbled upon technology they cannot control. Sharma smiled, and it was the smile of someone holding cards that her opponents could not see. Then, why are 17 empires needed to face one species with 12 colony worlds? Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and the Vethkai representative shifted uncomfortably. You mistake caution for fear, human, and you mistake humanity for an easy target. She activated a holographic display that showed a map of human space surrounded by coalition territories. You believe you have us trapped, and you believe your combined fleets will overwhelm our defenses, and you believe this war will be short and decisive. She let the display fade. You are wrong on all counts. The coalition had assembled 50,000 warships from across their combined territories. It was the largest fleet ever gathered in galactic history, and it was pointed directly at Earth. Human intelligence networks had tracked every ship and every movement and every communication. Admiral Chun knew exactly what was coming. He also knew that 90 ships could not defeat 50,000 through direct combat, but direct combat had never been the plan. Deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, a different kind of defense had been constructed. The Erebus protocol was Dr. Tanaka's masterwork, and it represented everything humanity had learned about dark matter manipulation. A network of satellites surrounded Earth, each one containing a specialized reactor designed for one purpose. If activated, they could phase an entire planet out of normal space. The concept was insane, and the energy requirements were astronomical, and the risks were beyond calculation. It was also humanity's only hope. When the coalition fleet surrounded Sol, they expected to find a desperate enemy preparing for a final stand. They found empty space. Earth was simply gone, along with its moon and orbital stations and defensive platforms. 50,000 warships had arrived to destroy a world that no longer existed in their reality. Coalition admirals shouted in confusion as sensors found nothing where a planet should be. Where is it? The fleet commander demanded. Where did they go? No one could answer because no one had ever seen anything like this before. While the coalition fleet searched empty space for a missing planet, the human navy struck 90 void breakers appeared simultaneously in the skies above 17 homeworld. She did not come to destroy, because destruction was not the message humanity wanted to send. Each ship fired a single precision shot at an empty monument or uninhabited structure. Then they vanished back into the void before any defense could respond on the Vethkai. Throneworld, the shot struck an ancient obelisk that had stood for 8,000 years on. The crystalline primary sphere had shattered an abandoned temple to forgotten god Sun World. Afterworld, the message was delivered with surgical precision. We were here, and we could have aimed anywhere. And remember that the Coalition fleet received reports of the attacks, and panic spread through their ranks if humanity could strike there. Homeworlds, while the greatest fleet in history guarded. So then nowhere was safe. Admiral Chung broadcast a message to the Coalition commanders. Your worlds are undefended, and your families are within our reach, and every monument you cherish is a target. His voice carried no anger, only cold certainty. We do not want to destroy your civilizations, but we will if you force us. He let that sink in for a moment. Withdraw your fleet and recognize human sovereignty, and this war ends today. The Coalition refused because pride would not allow them to accept terms from a younger species. But the cracks had begun to form on a dozen subjugated worlds. Resistance movements that had been dormant for centuries began to stir. Human agents had been busy during the 6 months of preparation. They could not share the dark matter technology because it required human neural interfaces to operate. But they could share something more valuable: hope that Tith resistance received weapons and training from human special forces. The Morrow Underground received communications equipment and strategic intelligence. The Crystalline Freedom Fighters received proof that the elder races could be defeated. Rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. Coalition forces that should have been attacking humanity were instead fighting to maintain control of their own territories. Supply lines stretched thin as resources were diverted to crush uprisings. The war that was supposed to be short and decisive became a grinding stalemate. Humanity controlled the void between stars, and the Coalition controlled the stars themselves. Neither side could land a killing blow, and the galaxy bled. Ambassador Shauna addressed the Concord once more 6 months into the war. You cannot destroy us, she said simply, and we will not surrender. She looked at the representatives of the younger races who had been watching in silence. But perhaps there is another way forward. The Tith ambassador rose to speak for the first time in recorded history. We stand with humanity. They declared. The Morrow followed, and then the crystalline, and then species after species that had been silent for millennia. The Coalition of Primacy found itself facing not just humanity, but a growing alliance of the oppressed. The old order was crumbling, and everyone could see it in her private quarters. Ambassador Shama received a coded message from Admiral Chun. The Coalition was planning something desperate, and their intelligence suggested a massive strike was coming, not against human worlds but against Earth itself. They had found a way to locate the phase planet. The war was about to enter its final phase. Shama looked out at the stars and wondered how many more would die before peace could be achieved. But she knew one thing. With absolute certainty, humanity would not be the ones to break. Commander Elena Vasquez had not seen Earth in 2 years. The UES Orpheus had been on continuous patrol since the war began, phasing through 30 combat engagements in 60 days. Her crew was exhausted, and her ship was battered, and something was wrong with all of them. The dark matter reactors had a cost that no one had anticipated. Extended exposure caused temporal displacement sickness, and it affected every crew member differently. Some lost hours waking up in places they did not remember, walking to some lost days with gaps in their memories that could never be filled. Some forgot the names of people they loved or the faces of children they had left behind. Vasquez herself had lost 3 days during their last phase jump. She had simply stopped existing for 72 hours, and when she returned, her crew told her she had been standing on the bridge the entire time, speaking to no one and seeing nothing, and responding to questions that no one asked. The cost of the war was measured in more than ships and soldiers. It was measured in pieces of themselves that slipped away with every jump through the void. But a fight. They kept fighting because the alternative was extinction. The Orpheus was patrolling the outer reaches of unexplored space. When their sensors detected something impossible, a structure floating in the darkness between galaxies, it was enormous, larger than any station ever built by any species in the Concord, and it was all beyond comprehension. "Commander," a sensor officer reported with confusion in his voice, "this structure predates every civilization we have ever encountered." Vasquez studied the readings and felt ice form in her stomach. How old? Billions of years at minimum, and possibly older. Then the galaxy itself. They approached carefully with weapons ready and shields at maximum. Station showed no signs of active power, but its hull was intact, despite eons of exposure to the void. Vasquez led the boarding party herself because she needed to see this with her own eyes inside. They found corridors built for beings that were not shaped like any species they knew. The architecture was wrong in ways that made their eyes ache. Angles that should not connect did connect, and spaces that should be larger were smaller, and distances that should be short stretched into infinity. But the technology was recognizable. Dark matter reactors lined the walls of engineering sections that spanned kilometers. Whoever had built this place had mastered the same power that humanity had only recently discovered, and they had done it billions of years ago. The central control room contained records preserved in a format that human computers could barely process. It took 3 days to decode enough to understand what they were reading. The builders called themselves the architects, and the closest translation the computers could provide. They had risen from a world long since consumed by its dying star. They had discovered dark matter manipulation and used it to build an empire spanning multiple galaxies. For millions of years, they had been the masters of reality itself. And then something happened. The records became fragmented and desperate near the end. We tore too many holes in the fabric of existence. The final logs read, "We did not understand that the void between realities is not empty. Something lives there, and something noticed us, and something is coming. We tried to seal the wounds we created, but it was too late. The hunger found us, and we could not stop it." The last entry was a warning broadcast on every frequency the architects could reach. "Do not use this technology because every wound you tear attracts its attention, and enough wounds will let it through. We are gone now, and we fell through into somewhere else, and there is no returning. Learn from our failure or share our fate." Commander Vasquez read the warning 3 times, and each time she felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Humanity had been tearing holes in space-time for 2 years. Thousands of phase jumps and hundreds of battles and countless wounds in the fabric of existence. Many was too many, and had they already crossed the threshold, she transmitted the records to Admiral Chun through the most secure channel available. His response came within hours. "Return to Seoul immediately, and tell no one what you found." Vasquez understood the order, but she did not agree with it. The galaxy deserved to know the danger they faced, but she was. Soldier and soldiers followed orders. The Orpheus made the jump back to human space, and Vasquez felt something watching her during the transita. Presence at the edge of perception that had not been there before. Something vast and patient and hungry. She reported to Admiral Chun, in person, presenting the evidence in a secure briefing room. Beneath the surface of Mars, he listened in silence as she explained what the architects had discovered and what had destroyed them. When she finished, he sat motionless for a long moment. "If we reveal this information," he said slowly, "we lose our only advantage against the coalition. If we do not reveal it, we might doom the entire galaxy. The coalition is trying to exterminate our species, Commander, and without the dark matter technology we cannot survive." "What good is survival if we unleash something that consumes everything?" Chun had no answer to that question, neither did Vasquez. They agreed to present the information to the council and let civilian leaders make the decision. But before the meeting could till the end be arranged, something happened. Deep in the void between stars, reality began to tear, not from human ships or coalition weapons, but from something pushing through from the other side. The hunger had noticed the wounds, and it was coming. Sensor stations across the galaxy detected the disturbance, and no one knew what to make of it. Space itself was bleeding, and something was trying to force its way through the wound. Vasquez watched the readings from the bridge of the Orpheus, and she knew exactly what was happening. The architects had warned them, and they had not listened. Now everyone would pay the price. She opened a channel to Admiral Chun. "Sir, we need to tell them everything because we need everyone working together to survive what is coming." Chun was silent for a moment, and she could hear the weight of the decision in his breath. "Agreed." He finally said, "Broadcast the architect records on all frequencies to every species in the galaxy. Let them see what we found and let them understand the stakes." Vasquez began the transmission and watched as the data spread across the stars. War between humanity and the coalition suddenly seemed very small. Something far worse was waking up, and the galaxy had very little time to prepare. The breach opened above Proxima Centauri without warning. One moment, the colony world orbited peacefully around its red dwarf star. The next moment, reality split apart, and something came through. It had no shape that sensors could define, and no form that minds could comprehend. It existed as a wound in the fabric of existence, and it was hungry in ways that transcended physical need. 12 million humans lived on Proxima Centauri, and they had no time to evacuate or fight or even scream. The entity did not destroy them in any conventional sense. It absorbed them, and it pulled them into itself, and they simply ceased to exist. In normal reality, ships that tried to flee were swallowed by extensions of the entity that reached across space like grasping tentacles made of broken geometry. Weapons fire passed through it without effect because it did not exist in the same way that matter existed. In 3 hours, an entire world was gone, not destroyed but erased as if it had never been. Admiral Chun watched the recordings in horrified silence. He had seen death on scales that would break lesser minds. But this was something beyond death, and something beyond understanding. The entity withdrew after consuming Proxima Centauri, but the breach remained open, a permanent wound in space-time that pulsed with wrongness, and through that wound more of the entity was slowly pushing its way into normal space-gen. Broadcast the architect records to every species in the galaxy, along with footage of what had happened to Proxima Centauri. "This is what we have awakened," he announced. "This is the price of our war and our technology and our arrogance." He paused and forced himself to continue. "But this is also a threat that no single species can face alone." The response exceeded his expectations. The coalition of primacy officially dissolved within hours. Former enemies contacted human command to offer their fleets and their resources, and their experts at 22 species that had spent millennia in competition now stood together, not because they trusted each other, but because they finally understood the stakes. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the breach. 300 human void breakers led the formation. 12,000 coalition ships filled the space behind them. It was the greatest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and everyone knew it might not be enough. Dianaka was 80 years old now, and her hands trembled when she worked, but her mind was still sharp, and she had been studying the entity since it first appeared. "We cannot fight it directly," she reported to the assembled commanders. "Conventional weapons pass through it, and even phase weapons only slow its expansion. Then what can stop it?" Chun asked. Tanaka pulled up a holographic display showing the breach. "The entity exists in the void between realities, and the breach is its doorway into our space." She highlighted the edges of the wound in space-time. If we can seal the breach, we can cut it off from its source. How do we seal a wound in reality itself? Tanaka was quiet for a moment before answering. We need to create a massive dark matter cascade at the heart of the breach, and the detonation would not just close the wound, but rewrite the laws of space-time around it. She met Chun's eyes. Nothing could ever open a breach in that location again. And what happens to whatever delivers this cascade? Total annihilation, and there is no possibility of survival. The bridge fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Someone would have to fly into the heart of that nightmare and die to save the galaxy. Chun expected to order volunteers, but he never got the chance. 3,000 crew members submitted their names within the hour. They understood what was required, and they stepped forward anyways. The battle began when extensions of the entity emerged from the breach. They were nightmare shapes that defied description and twisted geometry that hurt to perceive and hunger. Given form, coalition ships opened fire with everything they had, and their weapons passed through empty space where targets should have been, but the human void breakers could hurt them. Phase weapons disrupted the entity's extensions and forced them to reform. It was not enough to destroy them, but it slowed their advance. The battle became a desperate dance of survival. Void breakers phased in and out of reality, striking at impossible angles. Coalition ships provided supporting fire and absorbed attacks that would have overwhelmed the smaller human vessels. One by one, the void breakers fell as crew members exhausted themselves and reactors overloaded. But they kept fighting because retreat meant extinction. Admiral Chun watched his fleet die and knew that they could not win through attrition. The entity was infinite, and they were not. Prometheus. He called to the ship that had started everything. "It is time." Captain Sarah Okonkwo responded from the bridge of the first void breaker ever built. "We are ready, Admiral." Dr. Tanaka was aboard that ship because she refused to leave her creation. So were 3,000 volunteers who had chosen to trade their lives for the survival of everyone else. The Prometheus accelerated toward the breach, and the entity tried to stop it. Extensions reached out to grasp and consume, but the ship phased through every attack. Its reactor was already beginning the cascade sequence. There would be no stopping now. Okonkwo opened a channel to the fleet. "We are humanity," she said as her ship plunged toward annihilation. "We came from a small blue world, and we looked up at the stars, and we refused to accept our limitations. The breach grew larger in the viewport. We made mistakes, and we started wars, and we woke something terrible from the void between realities." The entity's hunger pressed against the hull, and crew members began to slip away into nothingness. But when the darkness came, we did not run, and we did not hide, and we did not abandon the galaxy we had endangered. Dr. Tanaka activated the final sequence with steady hands. We carried our fire into the heart of the darkness, and we burned it away. The cascade detonated for one instant. The Prometheus became a second sun brighter than any star. The explosion did not just destroy the ship, it rewrote reality around the Pois, breach, sealing it permanently and creating a scar in space-time that nothing could ever cross again. This breach, sealing it permanently and creating a scar in space-time that nothing could ever cross again, that nothing could ever cross again. The entity screamed in frequencies that shattered sensor equipment across the fleet. Cut off from its source, it began to fade and dissolve and disappear. Extensions that had been consuming ships simply stopped existing. The battle was over. The galaxy was saved, but the price had been paid in 3,000 lives that would never return. 1 year later, a memorial stood where Proxima Centauri had once orbited. It was a simple structure built by every species that had fought together against the entity. On its surface were inscribed the names of everyone who had died, and at its center burned an eternal flame. Admiral Chun retired from active service to tend that flame. He spent his days reading the names and remembering the faces of those who had sacrificed everything on Earth. A child asked her grandmother about the bright Light in the night sky, the old woman had served on a void breaker during the war, and she still carried the scars, both visible and invisible. That light marks where we learned what we are made of, she said softly. The child looked up with curious eyes. What are we made of? The grandmother smiled and pulled her close. The universe is dark and cold, and it does not care about us. She pointed at the light, but that does not matter because we make our own meaning, and we create our own warmth, and we carry our own fire. The child considered this for a moment. Is that why we won? That is why we always win. Her grandmother replied, because we never stop fighting for each other and for the light. Across the galaxy, species that had been enemies for millennia now worked together. The scars of the war would take generations to heal, but something had changed in the hearts of everyone who survived. They had seen the darkness, and they had faced it together, and they had won not through strength alone, but through sacrifice and unity, and the stubborn refusal to accept extinction humanity had brought fire to the stars, and the stars would never be dark again.